Unequivocally, the most intense, the most replayed and talked about moment from the two debates was the exchange between Senator Kamala Harris and former Vice President Joe Biden, when Harris brought up comments that Biden had made last week, and in line with comments he's made throughout his career in his memoir, about basically his positive working relationship with white Southern Democrats who are notorious segregationist senators.
I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden. I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
It's a mischaracterization of my position across the board. I did not praise racist. That is not true. The fact is that in terms of busing, the busing, you would have been able to go to school the same exact way because it was a local decision made by your city council. That's fine. That's one of the things I argued for, that we should be breaking down these lines.
Vice President Biden, do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No,
do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well, there was a failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision.
So that's where the federal government must step in. That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. That's why we need to pass the Equality Act. That's why we need to pass the ERA, because there are moments in history where states fail to preserve the civil rights of all people.
I have supported the ERA from the very beginning. I'm the guy that extended the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. We got to the place where we got 98 out of 98 votes in the United States Senate doing it. I've also argued very strongly that we, in fact, deal with the notion of denying people access to the ballot box. I agree that everybody, once they, in fact, anyway, my time's up. I'm sorry.
Today, Joe Biden was back on the trail trying to clean up the fallout from that clash last night.
I heard and I listened to and I respect Senator Harris. But, you know, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime committed to civil rights. I want to be absolutely clear about my record and position on racial justice, including busing. I never, ever opposed voluntary busing. And as a program that Senator Harris participated in, and it made a difference in her life.
Joining you now for more on the first round of Democratic debates, Howard Dean, former DNC chair and a 2004 Democratic presidential candidate, Amy Allison, president of the national political organization She the People, and Dorian Warren, president of the national community organizing group Community Change. Amy, let me start with you. So there's two levels I want to talk about this on, and we'll start with the kind of performance level, for lack of a better word, right? Just the dynamics of the exchange, and your impressions of the sort of sharpness of with which Senator Harris made her case and Biden's response.
Well, I was in the room and I watched as she turned toward Joe Biden and talked personally. This is something that, you know, Senator Harris is not really known for, talking personally. But when she was vulnerable and talked about her own experience and the hurt, she was really speaking of an experience many of us can deeply relate to. And calling him on his history really is a question of how committed are you to people who are just like me? When she said the little girl like me, I'm not usually emotional in a political setting. You know, I kind of teared up because it was so profound for me to watch a woman of color on stage calling out, you know, arguably one of the most recognized establishment Democrats in a context where black and brown women have felt ignored, particularly black women. In 2017, the country woke up to the fact that black women had been the backbone but had been ignored. We're very accustomed to Democrats who have traded our protections or our rights for political reasons, but this was a moment where she showed very directness. She took a lot of space, and he was defensive on his record. Yeah.
Yeah. Howard Dean, what did you think? I mean, it seemed to me that there are defenses that Joe Biden could offer in the moment. He's got a very long career, right? So in some ways, part of what he's going to have to do in this primary is talk about 40 years, thousands of votes, thousands of pieces of legislation. It seemed to me there were ways to handle that or defenses to offer that he didn't necessarily offer in that moment. What do you think?
Well, he's in a tough spot. The ground is shifting under his feet, as it is under my generation's feet. And you're seeing a youth movement take over the Democratic Party. And that was this Eric Swalwell's comment. But this is very much like the stuff that's going on with Me Too. What was maybe swept under the rug 30 years ago is not anymore. And so I'm not saying that Joe isn't going to be the nominee. He may well be. But that's what the battle really is changing. It's okay to compromise before. It's not okay to compromise now.
Well, let me say this, and actually, Dorian, because this is something you and I have talked about in other contexts, because this is not a defense of Joe Biden, but it's a context here that seems important. Mm-hmm. Federally mandated busing as a feature of a federal Department of Education desegregation program, as it existed in the mid-1970s and then was basically ratcheted back by the courts and political losses. Right. Bernie Sanders is the only person, I think, in the Democratic field calling for that. Julian Castro a little bit. And last night, Kamala Harris's press secretary, when asked, do you support busing, said yes, a one-word answer. But we don't, like, the actual, this is not a thing. That policy that he was getting raked over last night is a policy that the National Democratic Party and national white politicians have retreated from for 40 years across the board in cities blue and red, large and small.
100%. 100%. And I feel like I'm the last generation. I was actually bused to a magnet school in Chicago from the south side to the north side, literally, of the city. And it was, you know, for so many of us, it was transformational in terms of our life trajectories and mobility. Here's the thing. Nobody under 40 actually knows what that means. Like, what does busing mean? What does voluntary or forced or mandated desegregation mean? So it's interesting that it's now back right in the center of the Democratic debate. It is, I think, about, and Amy said this is how social movements have changed the nature of the Democratic Party. So there has been a racial justice movement, right, the movement for Black Lives, that many people say it's just focused on policing and criminal justice, but it's put these other issues of race front and center, and that was an interesting addition to the conversation around racial justice, around school segregation. Our schools have been resegregated. So there's a whole new conversation we're about to have about what is our commitment to desegregation.
Thank you, Amy. That's my point. Is that my only point is that it is easier to level a critique of a white Democratic politician in 1976, 1977 being against busing, which, to be clear, substantively, morally wrong, in my view, but politically the correct view in terms of the majority of his white voters, majority of the voters in Delaware. It's easier to level that critique than to affirmatively say in 2019, we should have federally mandated desegregation plans that involve busing kids.
You know, Joe Biden sent out a message to his list that said, look, the talk about race shouldn't be about the past. He wanted to basically, let's forget about that. Let's focus on the future. So, yeah, let's focus on the future. So we may talk about one specific set of policies and legislation like busing, which is indicative of a strategy used decades past. But what is his true commitment to changing the structural ways that black people have, you know, their futures have been limited by building in racism into the systems? What is that for people right now? And so it is what I thought was really fascinating and very powerful that Senator Harris did was she reintroduced herself to the country and placed herself in a legacy that is very powerful. If you use the word busing and you think about Ruby Sales or you think about the trajectory history of civil rights. She's indicating something that's bigger than policy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.